we have even more breaking news now. This time it's out of Egypt.
President Hosni Mubarak addressing the world, particularly Egypt, in just the last hour. Fox 35's Kel Ramaker in our studio right now. He's got the very latest on what he had to say.
Bob, initial reports were that Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak was going to step down. He doesn't plan to go anywhere just yet. He's basically staying in the palace, but he's passing some of his authority to his vice president, Omar Suleiman. He also says the Egyptian army will ensure the transition of power. The crowd of thousands watching his speech, initially believing that he may step down, obviously are not happy with his decision. A jubilant crowd quickly turned upset and dangerous, shouting, "Down with Mubarak." They want him down now, saying he hasn't done enough to end poverty or government corruption. During his speech, Mubarak says errors can happen in any political system. He says the protesters' demands are legitimate, but he says he won't give in to foreign dictators.
And this is something that I will never accept, to listen to something that is dictated to me from a foreign source, no matter what the source is, and no matter what the justifications are.
So despite all the hubbub, Mubarak plans to still stick around until September elections. He says he will not run again at that time. The protesters, though, they plan to stay in Cairo's Tahrir Square until their demands are met. It could be quite an ugly night over there. We'll keep you posted on this breaking story throughout the night. Kel Ramaker, Fox 35 News.
All right, Kel, thanks. Tonight we're trying to break down this crisis in Egypt in simple terms. First, why you should care about what's happening.
Also, of course, how this chaos overseas affects all of us Americans. Middle East expert Christopher Hinn answering our two big questions tonight. Christopher Hinn joining us now for our two big questions this afternoon. Chris, you just heard what President Mubarak had to say, handing over basically the presidential authority to the vice president. Is that going to be good enough for the Egyptian people, or will we see, the violence that we saw erupt in the streets of Egypt last week?
Well, Bob, if I was a betting man, I will tell you, no, that's not good enough. And that's what they've been saying for the last 2 weeks. They've known the answers. They want him to step down, and that's all. That's the only answer they want, and there's nothing else they'll accept. I'll be really surprised to see if that happens, Bob, because they believe that Omar Suleiman and the old guards are, I don't want no disrespect, but they're Mubarak juniors. That's what they look at them, and that's all they are.
They are not the new regime. We have to wait until at least September to theoretically elect in a new regime, if even that's going to happen. For those of us sitting here in Central Florida, those of us in the United States, Mubarak saying, I don't want to hear anything from, foreign leaders and so forth. So, okay, but why should we be so concerned about what's going on in Egypt? How is this going to affect us? Do we just stay completely out of it?
Well, if you look at history back in 1973 in October, and you look since Mubarak's been in office, we have been involved in the Middle East, and we can now just wash our hands and say, no, we're not going to do anything. But I think there is a way to do it. I think there's a strategy, and I think we need to step back and see how we can be not looked at as the rich uncle up in the hill. We need to be looked at as how can we help and restore civilization and restore free will of the people.
All right. Christopher Hinn. Christopher, always good to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob.
Of course, you can count on Fox 35 News for breaking details from Egypt tonight. We're going to have much more coming up at 6, at 10, and 11 o'clock tonight. The crisis in Egypt perhaps at its worst point yet. A stunner from Egypt's President Hosni Mubarak. It was thought that he was going to step down today. Instead, he announced to a crowd of hundreds of thousands that he is staying, but handing over power to his vice president. Protesters have been calling for him to leave the country for the last 17 days. They say that Mubarak has not done enough to end poverty or government corruption. Protesters in Tahrir Square were enraged by today's announcement. There they are. They're even chanting that Mubarak is not a Muslim and that he's against Islam. Protesters now want the army to take action. President Obama had this to say when it was believed that Mubarak was leaving.
And so going forward, we want those young people and we want all Egyptians to know America will continue to do everything that we can to support an orderly and genuine transition to democracy in Egypt.
But now that we know what we know, late tonight, the White House issuing a statement from the president. He questions Mubarak's commitment to meaningful change in Egypt.
All right, so what does all of this mean to us here in the U.S.? Middle East expert Christopher Hinn here tonight to talk more about this. Christopher, it's obviously been in headlines for weeks now. Even a Nobel Peace Laureate coming out saying Egypt will, quote, explode after Mubarak refused to step down. Do you think that's about to happen, or will the president finally listen to what the people claim that they really want?
Well, he handed the power, but not fully. He still has the role of a president. He still controls the Constitution. He still controls the Congress, the House. He still controls the ministers. So he has not handed that. He has not relinquished that power totally to the vice president. So he's still in control pretty much of that area. So unless he changes the Constitution, and that's what's going to make the change.
Right. So it's a false change, and in that sense, can it be more dangerous, to sort of act like you're conceding and then say, well, not totally.
Sonny, one of the things he did do, he met with the Minister of Interior, Antawi, and he actually gave him charge of the military. That's an interesting point, because now the military can rule on its own. He's no longer the commander-in-chief of the military.
Right. And there are questions now, now that you mentioned the military, what side, when they do come out to keep the peace, which, needless to say, they probably will in the near future, whose side are they on? Just last week, they were allegedly killing and injuring protesters. So whose side do they take now?
You got to be careful. It was not the military. It was a division of the military that protected Mubarak. And that's the military division that you're going to see the clash between the army and the military if this to happen. So you will see the military come up against each other, technically.
It's actually has the potential to be quite terrifying. We want to ask you this too, Christopher. There's a lot of talk about the Muslim Brotherhood. A lot of Americans not familiar with who that group is, what they represent, and frankly, if we as Americans should be scared.
Well, 2-3 weeks ago, no one knew of the Muslim Brotherhood. Honestly, I think we've given them too much credit. If you look at 2005, their vote was only 20%. Of the election back then.
Are they a radical group, Christopher?
Well, I don't think I can comment on that, but I can tell you that they're a very religious, fundamentalist group, yes. Radical depends on how you describe radical. I describe it different.
Right. Okay. Well, we certainly look forward to seeing what happens. Obviously, safety being the top priority there. Christopher Hinn, Middle East expert, thank you so much for coming in tonight.
Thank you, Sonny. Thank you.
And even after delegating authority to the vice president, Mubarak retains his powers, as Christopher said, to request constitutional amendments, also to dissolve parliament or the cabinet. We will continue to monitor the feeds we're getting from Fox News as well as its international partners. And if something big develops, we will pass it along to you.